My name's Greg Sterling. I'm the Dean of Yale Divinity School, and on behalf of the Divinity School and the university, we welcome you to our annual Margaret Lindquist Sorensen Lectureship. This lectureship was established in 1978 through the generosity of the honoree's son, Dr. Andy Sorensen, who graduated with a Bachelor of Divinity from this school in 1962. I had the privilege this fall to sit and eat lunch with his sister, Mary Beth Sorensen Kohler, who is married to David Kohler, a member of the same class. Unfortunately, Andy died unexpectedly several years ago. He led a very distinguished career. After completing his Bachelor of Divinity, he went on to do a PhD here in medical sociology, held faculty positions at Harvard, the University of Massachusetts, Johns Hopkins, was provost at the University of Florida, president of the University of Alabama, and president of the University of South Carolina, then went to Ohio State, where he unexpectedly and suddenly died. He established his lectureship to honor his mother, to deal with public life and ethics. And it seems most fitting to me that on the 50th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council, at the 50th year that Andy graduated as an alumnus of this institution, that we have one of the world's distinguished Catholic thinkers to address us this evening. And to introduce E.J. Dionne, I'm going to call on Professor Lamin Sane, who is the D. Willis James Professor of Missions and World Christianity here at Yale Divinity School. Professor Sane.
We are delighted and honored to have with us E.J. Dionne, a distinguished writer and journalist, to present the annual Sorensen Lecture. E.J. Dionne doesn't really need any introduction to this company. He is a distinguished columnist for the Washington Post and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., as well as university professor at Georgetown University. E.J. Dionne is the author of a very important book, Why Americans Hate Politics, which won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and was nominated for the National Book Award. His most recent book, Our Divided Political Heart, The Battle for the American Idea in an Age of Discontent, takes up the ambivalence Americans have about individualism and community. His lecture tonight, Our Divided Political Heart and the Election of 2012, could not be more timely. Welcome to Yale.
Well, thank you so very much for that kind introduction. It was so much nicer than the one I once got when I was giving a talk about politics in the Midwest, and the person ended, and now for the latest dope from Washington, here's E.J. Dionne. So thank you. It is such a great honor to be here at Yale. It actually is a tiny partial fulfillment. I was telling the dean, I always had an ambition to go to Yale Divinity School and Yale Law School, and I did neither. But it's sort of good to get a little piece of Yale. This is the second time I've been up here, and every time I visited, I've known that was a good idea to go to Yale Divinity School. So maybe someday you'll see me back. It's also good to see my friend Father Tony from Washington, who will correct any theological errors I make, although in a rather kindly way. Which is not what we're always accustomed to when we make theological errors. It's also, I love all those 0 years. It's also the 70th anniversary of the movie Casablanca, which actually raises all kinds of interesting political questions, probably closely linked with the fact that Vatican II happened, I think. I just want to say a couple things about ecumenism, since I am a Catholic here at Yale Divinity School. Two of my favorite ecumenical stories. One involves John F. Kennedy, and we all remember all the difficulties. He was the first Roman Catholic president. He was, on the one hand, running into anti-Catholic prejudice. On the other hand, he was counting on and received an overwhelming Catholic vote. There's a great debate among political scientists over whether Catholicism helped him or hurt him more. I'm on the help him side, but a lot of very shrewd scholars think it net hurt him, but he still won. And two of his advisors who were very attentive to Catholic issues were Theodore Sorensen, not the person after whom this lecture was named, and Arthur Schlesinger Jr., and they were speechwriters for Kennedy. And Kennedy had to give some talk to a Catholic group, and they wrote him a draft together, and Kennedy threw it in their faces and said, "This is the most Catholic speech I've ever read. Sometimes I think I am the only Protestant around here," said the first Roman Catholic president of the United States. On the other side, there's a story of Bill Clinton. There's also a true story where Bill Clinton very much impressed the Jesuits at Georgetown University. And he was apparently very good at Christian doctrine, and he was good at a lot of other things, very charismatic. And so a distinguished Jesuit at Georgetown called Otto Hentz called up, reached out to Bill Clinton and said he wanted to have dinner with him, and apparently he took him out to a famous burger place in Georgetown, and he sat across from Bill Clinton and said, "Bill, we have been talking, and we think there would be a place for you in the Jesuits." And Bill Clinton gave that fantastic smile he had, and I wish I could do a good Clinton. He said, "Father, wouldn't I have to become Catholic first?" They had absolutely no idea that Bill Clinton was a Southern Baptist. But he went on. He can persuade anyone of anything and did a great job in this election campaign. I thought the original lecture was going to be in the H. Richard Niebuhr room, and so I actually thought I would begin with a famous quotation from H. Richard Niebuhr, but at Yale Divinity School, it's always appropriate to quote H. Richard Niebuhr, who had a great influence on me, particularly his book Monotheism and Western Culture, a long, long time ago. But here's what he wrote in The Kingdom of God in America, and I quote H. Richard Niebuhr: "Institutions can never conserve without betraying the movements from which they proceed. The institution is static, whereas its parent movement has been dynamic. It confines men within its limits, while the movement had liberated them from the bondage of institutions. It looks to the past, although the movement had pointed forward. Though in content the institution resembles the dynamic epoch whence it proceeded, in spirit it is like the state before the revolution." Now, I think this is a fascinating quote about the quotation and a way of thinking about the relationship between political movements, particularly revolutionary movements, and then the regimes they create afterward. And while a campaign is not like a revolution, I think all of us can resonate a bit to Niebuhr's words, perhaps especially this year, because we have moved so very quickly from the broad argument of the campaign to the the great difficulty of governing on a deadline, described imperfectly, I think, as the fiscal cliff. To pick up Niebuhr's language, men and women in Washington, after dealing with large questions in the campaign, are confined within the limits of fiscal problems made even more difficult by divided government. Yet I want to argue that this election actually was extremely important and that its results will stay with us for some time. That is because I think this campaign was the culmination of an argument, the most basic kind of argument we can have, an argument about who we are as Americans. It is also an argument I want to argue that is deeply embedded in our national story. Now, the fact is, we Americans are a confusing people, and perhaps especially to ourselves. The self-portraits we create are often contradictory. The products of our culture, our movies, our art, our literature, all seem to celebrate conflicting values. Is our country better personified by the community-loving Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life, or by the rogue individualism of Clint Eastwood in Dirty Harry? I'm talking about the Dirty Harry Clint Eastwood, not the empty chair Clint Eastwood here. Does Woody Guthrie's "This Land Is Your Land" speak to us more directly, or how about Frank Sinatra's "My Way"? Is the American experiment unique because it recognizes the importance of solidarity that we see in John Steinbeck's novels, or the sanctity of independence as celebrated by Walt Whitman or Jack Kerouac? My book, Our Divided Political Heart, grew out of my love for the American story and these tensions. And although the first sentence of it refers to American decline and our worries about it, it's a distinctly anti-declinist book, and I will get back to that. And it argues, it's a hopeful book about our future, because I think the classic American balance and tension between individualism and community has helped us out of many scrapes before and can do so again. I love to quote, and many of you have heard this before, I suspect, the best line on us, I think, came from Winston Churchill, who said, "Americans can always be counted on to do the right thing after they have first exhausted all of the other possibilities." It takes us time, but we get there. And I should also say that my book is very critical of the Tea Party and its view of politics, but it was also inspired by the Tea Party. I believe the Tea Party was right to go back to the origins of our country, and that those of us who are more on the progressive side need to join them in an argument about this history. I think we've been too willing to leave the argument about American history to our friends on the right. We have been too reluctant to embrace the American story, which I think in broad terms is a progressive story. Should our conservative friends be the only people who carry around copies of the Constitution in their pockets? And the very distinguished law professor, some of you may know, Akhil Amar, gave me a tour of the Yale the museum today, and I had a picture in my pocket which I took out and forgot, of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, so I could take it out at that moment because I forgot my pocket copy of the Constitution. But our friends on the right shouldn't be the only people who carry around the Constitution. They shouldn't be the only people who quote the Federalist. We certainly shouldn't leave the Declaration of Independence to them. The most forward-looking politicians and moral spokespeople in our history did not do that. They understood the power of the Declaration of Independence. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, as many of you know, drew its inspiration from the promises of American history and the promises of the Declaration. Dr. King spoke famously of that promissory note that had been handed to African Americans that had come back stamped, as he put it, unpaid, insufficient funds. It was a very powerful way to make his case. Abraham Lincoln, whom we're celebrating a lot these days thanks to Steven Spielberg, his most important political speech before he became president, in the view of many historians, was his speech at Cooper Union in New York City. And his goal in that speech was to insist that the founders of our nation ultimately foresaw, as he did, the extinction of slavery in the United States. Again, Abraham Lincoln made an argument about our past in order to make an argument and frame an argument about our future. So what do I mean by our divided political heart? I believe that from the very beginning, Americans have been torn by a deep but I believe healthy tension between individualism and liberty on the one hand and our affection for and quest for community on the other. We are both of these things. We are not only one of these things. And I think too often, especially in recent years, we have told our story almost entirely on the individualistic side. We have emphasized individual liberty to the exclusion of our dedication to community and equality. We have not focused enough on how the liberty we prize depends upon our willingness to come to the defense of each other's liberty, how liberty depends upon strong communities, energetic government, and a concern for the common good. Consider the very first word of the Constitution of the United States. What's the first word of the Constitution of the United States? And I love asking that question because I love hearing groups of Americans say together the word "we." We don't do that very often these days. The preamble is a beautiful thing. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. Yes, welfare is right there in the first paragraph of the Constitution of the United States. And to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity, again, ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution. The Declaration is a perfect reflection of the balance between individualism and community. It begins by describing the unalienable rights that come from our Creator to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But in the very last paragraph, our founders pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. They understood that the liberty they were seeking to establish could not be established unless they acted together. Now, I like to think of the Declaration as our very first negative political ad. It puts negative advertising in a new light for you, perhaps a positive light. Just a couple of things I like to point out. Remember, Jefferson had that long list of abuses and usurpations, and he makes all of these charges against the king. Just a couple of facts about that list. Taxation doesn't even show up until number 17. And the Declaration is not about opposing taxes. It remonstrates the British Crown for imposing taxes on us without our consent. The consent was the issue, not taxes themselves. And the first two items are criticize the king because he has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. The founders were not anti-government zealots. They wanted us to govern. They wanted a government that could govern. Now, there was one great anti-government line in the Declaration. It's abuse number 10, and I want to just share it with you because I love the way it sounds. They accuse the king in this way. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. Now, I think of all the negative ads that Mr. Rove or the Koch brothers put on the air, none of them came close to that language. And I think the next time around they should study the Declaration, and they might do a little better. We've had a parallel argument related to the role of government in our history. I have spent a lot of time lately with the legacies of Alexander Hamilton and Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln. Some of you may have heard me talk and argue politics with my friend David Brooks on NPR. And when I finished the book, I told David that one of the most exciting things about it is I finally figured out why David is so crosswise to current American politics. I said, David, reading these Clay and Lincoln especially, I realized you are the last living, surviving American Whig. And David absolutely agreed, and since both of us have a certain sympathy for the Whigs, somebody suggested to us that we organize an event modeled after Woodstock called Wigstock. But we decided that such an event would be the most boring event in American history, so I promise you that we won't do that. But if you believe the federal government played little role in the development of our country, you have to read Hamilton, Clay, Lincoln, and a whole lot of other people out of the American story. Another question, when was the first American version of socialized medicine passed into law? Well, actually, it was passed into law and signed by conservative President John Adams in 1798. John Adams signed the Federal Marine Hospital, the act creating the Federal Marine Hospital Service. It funded hospitals across the country to treat sailors who were sick or got injured on the job. One of the more embarrassing things that's happened to me in the last several months is I went on Jon Stewart. Instead of referring to the folks protected by that act as sailors, I referred to injured seamen. You can only imagine what Jon Stewart did with that. I'm sorry, I had to share that with you. But, you know, so Adams signed the socialized medicine act into law, and there is no record in our history of mass campaigns against Adams care. And if you believe that our Constitution is absolutely clear and can be read only one way, then you have to confront the fact that within 3 years of the enactment of our federal Constitution, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, two of its leading authors and two of its leading interpreters, were at each other's throats over whether the federal government had a right to establish the Bank of the United States. That fight over what the Constitution said was the origin, really, of our first party system when we divided between Federalists and Jeffersonians. My chapter on the Constitution of the book is called One Nation Conceived in Argument. And I couldn't resist quoting my friend, the legal scholar Garrett Epps, who recently published a book, a very good book on the Constitution. He once said that Justice Scalia and other originalists root their jurisprudence in the following idea: I knew the founders were friends of mine, I know how they think. In fact, the Constitution was created out of a series of compromises, some of which we would now very much object to, like the compromise on slavery. It defends competing values, as former Justice David Souter has said. And I think we do ourselves a disservice in seeing our founders as unique or sainted people who received the Constitution from heaven. It's a disservice because, first, these were gifted politicians who engaged in an act of enormous political creativity. We have great reason to be grateful to them. But they were also adventurous. They were embarking on a radical experiment for its time, rooted in the idea that people could govern themselves. And so to think of our Constitution as a set of shackles designed to keep our country in the same condition it was in 1787, as a document that might prevent us from addressing new problems in new ways, I believe does a disservice to the bold and adventurous spirit of our founders. Hamilton and Clay were visionaries. Clay called his program the American system, and what's interesting about that is he called it the American system to distinguish it from the British system, which he said was rooted in laissez-faire. The American system was different from laissez-faire. We saw a public role working with the market to turn us into a prosperous nation. By the way, Clay favored a strong federal role in launching internal improvements, and I would like to launch a campaign to replace that ugly word infrastructure with Clay's very nice term, internal improvements. We might fund infrastructure better if we called them that. And then Clay and Hamilton both foresaw that the federal government would play a major role in building us into a great manufacturing nation. Now, I could go on about this history, but I just want to give a taste of that early period because I think that our friends in the Tea Party, when they argue that we were a small government nation, are actually not looking at the longer American story. I think they're looking at an exceptional period in our history, the one period when radical individualism was genuinely dominant. It was the period of the Gilded Age, the roughly 35 years from, say, the end of the Civil War to the rise of Theodore Roosevelt. And now it should be said that this radically individualistic period had an enormous effect. It had an enormous effect on what the Supreme Court did. It was in that period that corporations were declared people. And my favorite response to that, I have to say, came from the distinguished law professor Stephen Colbert. Upon hearing this idea of corporations as people, Professor Colbert said that he wanted his daughter to grow up and marry a really nice corporation. Herbert Crowley, the great progressive thinker who influenced Teddy Roosevelt, argued that progressives sought to use Hamiltonian means to serve Jeffersonian ends. They wanted to use an active federal government to ensure greater equality of opportunity in an economy that would not be dominated by the trusts or by a very small number of people. Those who are looking for encouragement in our current debates can just go back to some of the things Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson said when they ran for president in one of the great campaigns in our history 100 years ago, the 1912 election. That's another 0 year that we have reason to celebrate this year. They sounded at times like people walking off an Occupy Wall Street encampment. Wilson once warned that we were nearing a time, quotes, when the power of high finance would be greater than the power of government. It's astonishing how strong their rhetoric was. And I think what's important about this story, at least as I see it, is that the populists and progressives rebelled against the Gilded Age, not simply because they were innovative, although they were, And they did not simply reintroduce big government. I believe they were restoring the old American balance, exemplified by Clay, Hamilton, and Lincoln. The balance between individualism and community, between government and the market, between public and private concerns. And for over 100 years, we were governed under the long consensus established by these progressives. It helped create the New Deal, the Great Society, and what we came to call the American century. The great advances in civil rights, women's rights, equal protection, and social justice all occurred within the context of this long consensus. And in the 100 years after TR assumed the presidency, government did grow, but so did individual liberty. The state assumed new roles, but individual opportunities expanded. New regulations protected the air and the water, the integrity of food and drugs, the safety of workplaces and consumer products, and American capitalism flourished. Workers organized into unions that advanced the interests of those who depended upon their labor, not capital, for their livelihood. And labor organizations helped create a more social form of capitalism based on widespread property ownership and upward mobility. Previously excluded groups were steadily brought into the larger American community to share in the economy's bounty and the responsibilities of self-government. The U.S. continued to welcome newcomers, and we created the most diverse democracy on earth. Now, for the last 4 years, and that's why this election was so important, this long consensus has been under attack as it has not been under attack before. And I think what needs to be recognized is how far many of our friends in the Republican Party and the conservative movement, I say that honestly because I have a lot of conservative friends whom I enjoy arguing with, that they have strayed from their own history and their own past commitments. They have chosen, on principle it could be said, to make middle ground politics impossible. They have done this by jettisoning their communitarian commitments, by adopting a highly restrictive view of the federal government's role, and by advancing a view of the Constitution that would prohibit or restrict activities that the federal government has undertaken for a century or more. So we talk a lot about gridlock in Washington. When two sides do not operate within the same framework, do not identify the same problems, or don't even share a common understanding of our history, the difficulty of finding accord cannot be ascribed to pettiness or selfishness or to a lack of imagination. It reflects the fact that the country has reached a time of choosing, to echo the title of Ronald Reagan's memorable speech for Barry Goldwater in 1964. And that is why I think the 2012 election was so important. It was that time of choosing. A few weeks before my book was published this year, a friend, my assistant at work actually, who had read an early draft, had some news for me from a Bruce Springsteen concert. How many Springsteen fans are in the room? Ah, good. Yes, I love Springsteen. And she came back very excited from this conference, and she said I had to listen to this new Springsteen song that she saw as offering a moving musical summary of the core themes that I've just laid out. And she also said that it might serve as a perfect anthem for President Obama's re-election campaign. Now, those of you who are Springsteen fans know what I'm talking about. I immediately went out, purchased Springsteen's Wrecking Ball album, and found myself listening over and over as the boss, strong and maybe just a bit plaintive, instructed us, wherever this flag is flown, we take care of our own. Now, my friend was a prophet, and for me, an inspiration. Less important is the fact that I incorporated the Springsteen song in talks I gave as I traveled around the country, talking about this divided heart of ours, and how we had to stop ignoring our community embracing side. I love drawing a connection between our Puritan past and our Springsteen present. Now, you may well ask, what in the world does Bruce Springsteen have in common with Puritans? Well, let me tell you what he has in common with Puritans. They never ask yourself a question you can't answer. Many of you remember that Ronald Reagan loved to describe the United States as a shining city on a hill. And that Reagan line came from a speech, a sermon by John Winthrop. He gave it in 1630. It was entitled A Model of Christian Charity. And my favorite line goes, "We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our community as members of the same body." I think Rush Limbaugh might call John Winthrop a socialist. But when you listen to that and you listen to Springsteen, they are making exactly the same point. Arguably, Springsteen in a somewhat more compact way. And my friend was not only helpful to me, it turned out the Obama campaign independently came to the same conclusion, and "We Take Care of Our Own" did become a campaign anthem. For those who ever went to an Obama rally, it punctured his rallies all over the country. If you stayed up late enough to watch his victory speech, the first words you heard after he was finished were Springsteen singing "We Take Care of Our Own." And I think this was the "We Take Care of Our Own" election. The campaign ended with Americans reaffirming the long consensus that I've described, this century-long balance, to a degree that surprised even me, who had a kind of interest in this. The arguments that I've sort of talked about here, I think, were very much at the heart of the campaign. On the Republican side, Mitt Romney's comments about about 47% of us being hopelessly dependent, and his running mate Paul Ryan's past interest in Ayn Rand's philosophy and his interest in the idea of dividing us between makers and takers, I think very much spoke to a sense that we were going back to this, some ideas of the Gilded Age, including, albeit in a more muted form, some of the ideas of social Darwinism, which took hold in those years. On the other side, Obama ran explicitly in defense of government's role in tempering market outcomes. It turned out that his most controversial and interventionist policy, probably the policy that came closest to the socialism that his opponents wrongly accused him of espousing, was also the most politically beneficial choice he made. I'm referring to the rescue of the auto industry. And absent that action, it is very likely that President Obama would have lost Ohio, probable that he would have lost Michigan as well. The Midwest heartland responded to an approach aimed at preserving the economic vitality of communities throughout their region. It was, in a way, a Henry Clay moment. I have a feeling, although one should never conscript history this way, that Clay would have been for the auto rescue if he had had any idea what an automobile was. But this was also the election in which economic ideas and judgments were not simply about unemployment and growth rates. It was an election about values. It was widely said that our friends in the Tea Party had transformed the economic debate into a new culture war, and so it had. The makers and takers rhetoric pointed not to a society defined by mutuality, in which the better off helped the worse off to escape dependency, but as a nation stuck in a zero-sum game. What was taken from the affluent, in this view, was seized by those intent on preserving their own dependent status. Now, to be sure, Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan tried to take the rough edges off the rather stark view I have described here. And indeed, as Election Day neared, they were given more and more to the language of compassion. Ryan even gave a very interesting speech on poverty that sought for a brief moment to revive some of compassionate conservatism's themes. But beneath it were those ideas that animated the 47% speech, and the release of that speech, I think, will prove to have been one of the campaign's most consequential moments. It froze in place a Romney who had run far to the right in the primaries. And Obama didn't run away from the larger philosophical argument, and as he had to some degree earlier on in his administration. In fact, the larger argument about philosophy and the direction of our country was essential to ensure that the election would not hinge simply on unemployment rates alone. And he enlisted as his ally another Democrat who had understood as well as he had the rhythms of a politics rooted in the common good and the idea of community. I am referring to Bill Clinton's speech at the Democratic Convention in Charlotte. I just have to tell you, I was there in Charlotte as a journalist, as a columnist, and I was so struck that Bill Clinton added on the run 2,000 words to that speech. And the speech went on, and that audience in Charlotte would have happily taken an hour more. And I realized that Bill Clinton fans are just like fans of a favorite rock and roll band. They always want the long version of the song. And they were very happy to have Bill Clinton do it. And that was, I think, the moment when the Obama argument really began to gel. Clinton, if you may remember, 20 years ago, another zero date, had a slogan, opportunity, responsibility, community. And that's what he talked about in that speech. The clincher line was, you see, we believe that we're all in this together is a far better philosophy than you're on your own. And in his election night speech, President Obama summarized the argument that he had made over the previous 15 months. If I may quote just a couple of paragraphs from the president's speech. This country has more wealth than any nation, but that's not what makes us rich. We have the most powerful military in history, but that's not what makes us strong. Our universities, our culture are the envy of the world, but that's not what keeps the world coming to our shores. What makes America exceptional are the bonds that hold together the most diverse nation on earth, the belief that our destiny is shared, that this country only works when we accept certain obligations to one another and to future generations, that the freedom from which so many Americans have fought and died for comes with responsibilities as well as rights, and among those are love and charity and duty and patriotism. That's what makes America great. And I think it does. The 2012 campaign began, I think, on August 2nd, 2011. That's when President Obama signed the deal ending the deficit fiasco. At that moment, I think the president relinquished his last illusions that he could make deals with a conservative movement that was on the track that it had been on until Election Day, at least. And I think that a Republican majority that was both inspired and intimidated by the Tea Party actually was demanding that the president renounce every principle dear to him about the role of government in the 21st century. And so you had this interesting experiment because if the 2012 election was the Tea Party, 2010 election, I'm sorry, was the Tea Party's triumph, the 2012 election was going to seal that triumph or end up being its comeuppance. And I think that is what it proved to be. Now, if you want to know where the election was decided, I think that we knew before the results were in what had happened to this great debate over government. In many ways, Mitt Romney's finest hour was that first debate, and it was deeply revealing. It marked the beginning of Mr. Romney's hard scramble toward the political middle in the campaign's final month. This was as important a signal about where opinion in the country lay as the election result. Romney's decision to do what he did that night meant that a newly radicalized conservative movement in the Tea Party had lost the 2012 election before the votes were counted. And Romney would not have tried to move back from so many of those positions if he believed that the country were ready to endorse the full-throated conservatism that he embraced to win the Republican nomination. Instead, at that moment of the campaign, unlike Barry Goldwater, he sought to be more an echo than a choice. He offered a kind of chorus of Me Too's And the fact that conservatives went along suggested that they had reached the same conclusion. It turned out that there had been no profound ideological conversion of the country in 2010. We remain the same moderate and practical country we have long been. In 2010, voters were upset about the economy, Democrats were demobilized, and the president was clearly not yet ready to fight. All the conservatives had left in October of this year was economic unease, and that was ebbing. And so I think this election decided a great deal. Ideas have consequences is one of the conservative movement's most honored slogans, and it's a good slogan. And I think the fact that in the end, the Republicans had to escape the consequences of some of those ideas, particularly the idea of radical individualism, tells us what we need to know about the outcome of this philosophical battle. And for me, that offers us reasons for hope. I've expressed frustration up to this point over what conservatism has become. But I hope that conservatives might rediscover both their moderate and their communitarian sides. True, there are some on the right that David Frum, the thoughtful conservative dissenter, has called the conservative entertainment complex. They wanted to deny some of the lessons of the election. They wanted to blame it all on Romney or concoct other theories that required no fundamental rethinking. But most conservatives, I think, know that something had gone badly wrong. Against all expectations at the beginning of the year, the Democrats not only held the Senate, but actually gained seats. Their majority padded by the own goals scored by Tea Party candidates Messrs. Murdoch and Aiken. The Republicans held the House of Representatives, but largely because of gerrymandered districts and the concentration of the Democratic vote in urban areas. Democrats actually led the Republicans in the popular vote in House races, just a fun fact, by almost exactly the same margin that Al Gore led in the popular vote in 2000. And then there was the size of Obama's triumph. It's up to over 4 million votes now, and victory in every swing state except North Carolina. Now, many Republicans quickly concluded that the president's margins among Latinos required Republicans to abandon their nativist rhetoric and wholesale opposition to immigration reform. And that is progress, and we'll see how much progress we make. But I don't think it will be that simple for the right. For one thing, a more moderate stand on immigration could threaten new divisions in the party, and its weakness among both Latinos and women owed not simply to immigration or to social issues, but to the fact that both groups are more sympathetic to government's role in the economy in promoting upward mobility than the current conservative doctrine allows. A party that wants to govern has to do more than run against government. They could do worse than think about a book by a great Yale graduate named William F. Buckley, Jr. It will surprise you, but Bill Buckley is one of my heroes. I want to be about 5% as effective on behalf of my own ideas as Bill Buckley was on behalf of his ideas. But there was a side to Buckley that I think we need to pay attention to now, and conservatives need to pay attention to. About 20 years before he died, he wrote a book called Gratitude. And in this book, Buckley talked about what we owe back to this country that had protected us and nurtured us. And I swear that if Bill Buckley had run in a Republican primary, the founder of the modern conservative movement had run in a primary over these last 4 years on the basis of the book Gratitude, he would have lost the primary. I think that's something our conservative friends should think about, and I think they are. Take two conservative columnists, Ross Douthat of the New York Times and Mike Gerson of the Washington Post. Here's what Ross Douthat wrote after the election. What the party really needs, much more than a better identity politics pitch, is an economic message that would appeal across demographic lines, reaching both downscale white voters turned off by Romney's Bain Capital background and upwardly mobile Latino voters who don't relate to the current GOP fixation on upper bracket tax cuts. This is Ross Douthat talking, not me. He cited another new look conservative, as I've taken to calling them, Henry Olsen of the American Enterprise Institute, who argued that Republicans could find pardon me, a way of opposing an overweening and intrusive state while still recognizing, as Olson put it, that government can give average people a hand up to achieve the American dream. Sounds like we take care of our own to me. And then Mike Gerson. Here's just a couple of paragraphs from a column that Mike wrote. Some of the most important intellectual groundwork is needed on the role of government. Mitt Romney had a 5-point plan to encourage job creation. He lacked a public philosophy that explained government's valid role in meeting human needs. Suburban women heard little about improved public education. Single women, particularly single mothers, heard little about their struggles apart from an off-putting Republican critique of food stamps. Blue-collar workers in, say, Ohio, heard little about the unique challenges that face declining industrial communities. Latinos heard little from Republicans about promoting equal opportunity and upward mobility. And this is Mike some more, one more paragraph. Neither a vague pro-business orientation nor Tea Party ideology speaks to those Americans, except perhaps to alienate them. Conservatives will need to define a role for government that addresses human needs in effective market-oriented ways. Americans fear public debt and they resent intrusive bureaucracies, but they do not hate government. Now, those of us who are on the progressive side harbor a certain skepticism about whether conservatives can come up with a plausible program along these lines without backing away from some of their fundamental beliefs about the relationship between markets and government. Nonetheless, the fact that the 2012 results have pushed so many thoughtful conservatives toward a new appreciation of the long consensus, I think can be counted as a victory for a more balanced and less divisive approach to politics and governing over the coming years. Obama's re-election was at once a deeply personal triumph and also a victory for a younger and highly diverse and broadly progressive America that rallied to him. It was a result that ought to settle this bitter argument that ground the nation's government to a standstill. Repeatedly, he asked voters to settle Washington's squabbles in his favor, and I think that's one of the things that happened in this election. People talk about mandates. I'm not sure the word mandate is all that useful. I think the idea that voters settle arguments and politicians decide which arguments they settled helps us more, and I think that is what happened in this election. And so a president who took office on a wave of emotion, I think, may have won something more durable in this election. It was a smaller majority, but it was a majority that had thought hard about his stewardship, had thought hard about what the argument of the last 4 years had meant, and decided to let him finish the job he had begun. Yet, I don't think this should be seen as the beginning, as the end of the story. I think this is now the beginning of the story. Having won vindication for the long consensus, I think the next generation of progressives, and I see some of them here in this room, need to prove that the long consensus is capable of renovation, that it can restore the living standards of Americans in the nation's industrial heartland and in the inner cities and in the abandoned rural areas. I think one thing that both Romney and Obama supporters had in common, particularly the angriest among them, is that they very much want to rid the nation of this fear of decline. They want a confidence in the future that is rooted in real progress and genuine and broadly shared prosperity. I think Obama, like Clinton before him, understands the importance of the nation's communitarian tradition. I think the movement he gathered behind him does too. I think that progressives, and everyone in this room, it turns out, remembers that the first word of our Constitution is the word we. We know that ours is a country that truly believes that we should take care of our own, and that doing that requires attention to the world beyond our borders and the global economy that is transforming the way economies work everywhere. Community is a noble ideal, but building and strengthening it requires practical work and the bold and persistent experimentation that Franklin Roosevelt commended to us, and that is still the calling of all who would call themselves progressive. I want to close on two themes. One is relates to the argument that you often have among Christians, since I am at a divinity school, and there's a lot of curiosity about how is it that an American evangelical movement that was so powerfully connected to some of our strongest progressive traditions has become significantly more conservative in recent years. We forget that evangelicals were at the heart of the fight against slavery. Northern evangelicals, one should say, people in places like this, where I am standing. We forget that William Jennings Bryan, who many people remember primarily from the movie Inherit the Wind, it's true. It was, in fact, a leading progressive politician, probably the man who did more to transform the Democratic Party into a progressive party, an early advocate of women's suffrage, an advocate of world peace, an advocate of the income tax, progressive taxation, and his opposition to Darwinism was rooted in his opposition to social Darwinism, about which he was right, even if he was wrong about the science of Darwin. I think many things happened to turn the evangelical movement more conservative. I think when the social gospel movement came along, I think many evangelicals saw that the movement was more social than it was gospel, and that a gulf, a theological gulf opened up between evangelicals and fundamentalists who had conservative theology and many of the social gospelers who had a more liberal theology, when for a very long time both of these camps had battled together on behalf of social justice and those left out. And I also think that we need a dialogue between two kinds of people. You may have had this experience, particularly those of you who are divinity students. I have been struck that conversations about Christianity often come down to what people have to say about Jesus and what Jesus' role was in their lives and in the world. And you tend to think that you've run into a more conservative person theologically and often politically when they respond that they are devoted to Jesus because Jesus changed my life. And then you run into more progressive Christians who say they are followers of Jesus because Jesus changed the world. Now, there are many people, particularly in the African American tradition, who say both those things at the same time, that Jesus changed my life and Jesus changed the world. But I would love to just invite people at this great divinity school to have a conversation, and I've defined it specifically in Christian terms, but I think it's a larger conversation about spirituality as well, about what spirituality's role is in transforming individuals and what its role is in inspiring social change. Because again, to go back to Dr. King, I think some of the most powerful agents of change in our country's history have brought a spiritual and often Christian dimension to a ministry that spoke to everyone, regardless of their faith, including people of no faith at all. And then I have to close by going back to my friends, John Winthrop and Bruce Springsteen, because I think both have spoken to some of the very best aspects of what makes us Americans. I think we will honor our past and build a more secure and just future by remembering with them that building a nation where liberty thrives requires us to stand with each other and make each other's conditions our own. That is every bit as much part of our creed as the liberty that we rightly prize. And it is this feeling for each other that will allow our great national experiment in self-rule to endure and to prosper. Thank you all very much.
Would you be willing to take a cup? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
We can take a handful of questions before we adjourn to some refreshments. So please, would you identify yourself?
I think it violates the Catholic tradition to stand between anyone and a drink, but nonetheless, but I would love to. I would love to do Q&A. By the way, I always like to say I love dissenting questions. One of my favorite uncles is someone I argued politics with for 35 years, and his kids, my cousins, were kind enough to ask me to do the eulogy at his funeral, and I made a point of quoting Richard Nixon in my eulogy. And it was a Nixon line I actually liked, but as I told the people in church, I quoted Richard Nixon because I thought that if he heard me, my Uncle Ray would come back to life and rise out of the casket just to tell me, I knew you'd be quoting Nixon someday. So I welcome dissents.
Thank you for an inspiring lecture. Since you brought up the Catholic tradition, what do you think has happened to the Catholic tradition in American politics?
Do I sense a Catholic tradition in your wonderful accent? Am I correct? That's a long story, as you know better than anyone. I mean, I think that one of the things that in the short term has been forgotten is the role of the Catholic tradition as an engine for social reform, and the role of Catholic social thought in promoting social reform. There's a wonderful writer called Lou Daly who wrote a book called God's Economy that I recommend to you if you haven't seen it. But Lou wrote a wonderful essay where he argued that the Catholic bishops, American Catholic bishops' 1919 program for social reconstruction almost perfectly prefigured the New Deal. That it was very new, that Catholic social teaching has always had this balance between an opposition to too much collectivism. The Catholic Church was anti-socialist, although in many trade unions they ended up allied with socialists. But it was also critical of pure market capitalism. And so the Catholic Bishops' 1919 program was very progressive and sought, and I think Catholics, the Catholic social thought has always been a kind of American third way, if you will. And I think sort of Catholic thinking on economics has always been a kind of third way. And I think it's been reflected right through to Pope Benedict, in fact, in his first, his encyclical, his social justice encyclical. I had the occasion, because the encyclical came out right before President Obama visited with Pope Benedict. Everyone, of course, was thinking, what's he going to say to Obama about abortion? I couldn't resist writing a column saying that the president will meet with someone whose views on economics are far to the left of his own. Because, in fact, if you read Benedict's critique of the workings of pure capitalism, he's not anti-capitalist, but he's against pure capitalism. Now, I think that several things have happened within the American Catholic tradition over the last several years. One, it wasn't simply Roe versus Wade and the reaction to the abortion issue within the church, because I think right through the 1980s, thanks to Cardinal Bernardin, the leader, the president of the Bishops' Conference, great Archbishop of Chicago, he developed his idea of a seamless garment, where the church was pro-life across the board, war as a last resort, concern for life after birth through natural death, not simply concern about abortion, opposition to the death penalty. And up through the 1980s, the Catholic bishops issued two very progressive letters on war and peace and on social justice. But I think in recent years, with the appointment of more conservative bishops, you have seen some very important voices in the church argue that the Bernardin approach, the seamless garment approach, was, in their view, diluting, D-I-L-L-U-T, diluting the church's commitment on the life issues. And I think you also had conservative Catholics who didn't mind at all pushing back some on the social justice tradition in the church, allied with them. And I'm sort of defining two groups. That one group where I think they were conservatives who wanted to push back against the whole thing. The other were bishops who deeply believed that the abortion issue, the right to life issue, was foundational to everything else and wanted to put that front and center. I think from my point of view as a more progressive Catholic, that has had the a couple of unfortunate effects. Unfortunate effect number one is I think it's pushed a lot of young Catholics out of the church. And that's something, I wrote a column about that this week, where I really want the church to think of, the leadership of the church to think about what message it is sending to younger Catholics when its focus is almost entirely on this set of issues and not the broad tradition of the church. Secondly, there's not enough focus on what the church actually does. I hope she doesn't mind, my daughter, who's a senior in high school, spent last summer working at a great Catholic program in Silver Spring, Maryland, called Shepherd's Table. And it's a wonderful program for the homeless run by the church. And she loved everybody who worked in that program, from the person who ran it to the folks who worked in the kitchen. She said they were some of the best people I ever met. And she came home one night and said, why doesn't the church talk more about this and not some of the other things that the church talks about? And I just think the church should bear witness to the work it actually does in this sphere. And I also think they need to talk with a lot more compassion when they talk about abortion. Carrying a child to term for 9 months is one of the most generous acts any human being engages in. And I think when we're talking about abortion, we have to understand what that means, what that is asking of what the commitment to life actually means, what we're asking for women. I think the church should also think about whether making abortion illegal would actually have a substantial effect on reducing the number of abortions in the country. I think there is an opportunity for progressives and conservatives to ally we do have too many abortions in America. There are ways of bringing down the abortion rate. Many of the things it would take to bring down the number of abortions would involve compassion and care for poor families, and particularly poor women. And we should make life easier, not harder, for women who are going to bring their children into the world. I think after the election, I'm sorry for the long answer, but it's a matter that engages me very much personally. I think after the election there's a real opportunity. I think that the most conservative bishops were surprised by the result. I guess they believed some of the polls that other conservatives believed. I didn't actually believe those polls, but I could have told them. But I think they were actually surprised by the result. Catholics voted narrowly for Obama, partly because of an overwhelming support for him from Latinos, who are the fastest growing part of the American Catholic Church. And I think that there may be I'm hoping there's a revisiting of the whole fight over the contraception mandate. I think there are ways in which that could be worked out if the bishops want to do it and the administration's willing to do it. I think there's great room for cooperation between progressives, certain kinds of compassionate conservatives in the Catholic Church on immigration. And the church has been at the forefront on that issue. And I hope they sort of worry about young people like my daughter and so many other young Catholics, because I think they do not always present the most attractive side of our tradition. And I think it's a shame when you push people away from the gospel. So thank you. Now I'll try to be shorter.
Thank you very much. I'm Georgetown class of 2011.
Oh.
Hoy Saxa, good to see you.
Yes, good to see you.
You gave a compelling narrative about the grand consensus in American politics being this idea that our destinies are united and joined together. I wonder, sort of non-economic social issues on the left, how do those sort of positions fit into this narrative of our common destiny? I think, for example, of the slogans, my body, my choice, and the government shouldn't tell us who to marry, for example, how exactly do those fit into this narrative? And also, you praise communitarianism. I'm wondering, where on the left do you see endorsements for non-governmental local civil society?
Where say that last?
Where from the left do you see those sort of endorsements of local civil society that are not on the governmental level?
Well, actually, I'm a person on the left who very much cares about non-governmental civil society. I think that Alan Wolfe actually has probably, up at BC, has probably written about it more. I think that just to pick up on your last point really quickly, I think that the left has within its history a lot of resources, intellectual resources, to talk very sympathetically and positively about non-governmental civil society. I mean, if you look at the early documents of the New Left before it went haywire in the 60s, the whole idea of participatory democracy, the Port Huron statement from SDS had a lot of elements of non-governmental civil society in it. And I am one of those who believes that the notion of the state cooperating with religious institutions to promote social justice and to engage in works of charity is something that can be done within the confines of the First Amendment without crossing lines we don't want the state to cross. And actually, if you, a friend of mine just ran the numbers on this. The Obama administration has actually given more money, for example, to Catholic groups than the previous administration did. So that Obama has done more without talking about it, partly because sometimes it raises hackles on the liberal side. I do think there is to go to the first half of your question. On the one hand, I would separate sort of gay marriage from some of the other issues, because I actually think gay marriage is the most conservative demand the gay movement ever came up with. You know, and indeed, when the gay movement, you know, when the you know, when this first arose within the gay rights movement, a lot of gay rights advocates were opposed to it because it was a kind of concession to a sort of bourgeois morality. And I've argued, my friend David Brooks has argued eloquently, that the people who should most be for gay marriage are traditionalists and social conservatives, because what we ought to want to promote in our society is fidelity and commitment. This is demand within the gay community for a chance to recognize fidelity and commitment and publicly honor fidelity and commitment. But yes, I think there is an interesting argument to be had between, and I write about this a lot in the book, between a kind of purely libertarian left and a more communitarian left. Now, what I try to be careful about is I'm a libertarian too, in the sense that I believe personal liberty is one of the core American values. I just don't believe it is A, the only American value, and B, I don't believe we can preserve liberty without the strong set of community institutions, a kind of web of mutual support. That liberty without community is not going to last. And so that's where I'm more for calling for dialogue with our libertarian friends and asking them to understand the limits of libertarianism even on its own terms. And that includes areas, you know, of sexuality that we need to address. But again, if you go back to the Catholic Church and other sort of traditional institutions, I think that they're missing a chance to join a richer conversation in these areas, where I think they can be on the more communitarian side. And again, I hope this election sort of pushes people back a little and encourages them to rejoin the conversation a different way from the way they have up to now. Can I have one more? Okay. I just don't want to. There was, yeah, there was. I saw one. Oh, what?
Do I need a microphone? I have a loud voice. I have a long familiarity with the Catholic Church. I worked for Bishop Fulton Sheen.
For Bishop Sheen?
Bishop Sheen.
You're not old enough to have worked for Bishop Sheen.
I'm 70, almost 72
That's
years old.
shocking. Wow.
Yes.
Your work for the Bishop Sheen served you well.
I know it did, and I love that man. And at the time, he was working on the Second Vatican Council. When I went to work for him first, he was going back and forth to Rome. And at that time, the thing was open up the windows and let the fresh air in. But I was just listening to, I mean, I feel like you are, and it's okay, you know, to champion the Catholic Church and cause. I am, however, another victim in the sense of this closed-mindedness which has come on the Catholic Church. I'm divorced Catholic, and you know, I was actually quite shocked when I went in first, and you know, after that and after my divorce, which was, everybody says it's not their fault, but the thing is that I figured, well, you know, I'm just practicing my religion, and I was told, if you want to go get yourself an annulment, then you could come get the sacraments. But that's just, you were talking about gay rights within the church, and when you talk about, hopefully they'll get the change, and this is my thing, is while John Paul was considered, oh, you know, just that man that went out there and kissed the ground and visited everybody who was a rock star, however, he was ultra-conservative, has brought in Benedict, and the thing is that he had a long enough term. he kept in there that almost everybody is conservative, all these cardinals, and I don't think there's any hope of change in the near future.
Okay, let me end this, try to inject an element of hope, even though I agree with some of what you said about the church. First of all, on Pope John Paul, I think there's a great paradox about John Paul, which is, to me, the achievements he had that we will remember most 100 years from now are actually the liberal achievements. And by that I mean the fact that he ratified some of the changes that were made by Vatican II in relations with other faiths. I mean, I got to cover the Pope when he visited the Roman synagogue, which was something unimaginable before Vatican II. The fact that he did that, the fact that he condemned anti-Semitism in a very powerful sermon, I think that lasts for a long time. I think that the Catholic Church in some fundamental ways switched sides on the issue of democracy in Vatican II, and we became, having been skeptical as a church of democracy in certain important ways, became its advocates. I think John Paul ratified that too. So I think on the one side, his greatest achievements will be, in the broadest sense, liberal achievements. On the other side, you're quite right in terms of, particularly here in the United States, in the last 10 years of his papacy, he appointed a far more conservative group of bishops. I remember my conservative friends being overjoyed when he named Cardinal Law and Cardinal in New York, O'Connor. Although O'Connor actually was a great labor guy and a great social justice guy. But you know, at the time, people joked that they were law and order. You know, and so these were their friends as well as their critics. And so I think that is another part of the legacy. I, like many American Catholics, and especially someone who has daughters, thinks the church really does need to look again at the issue of women's ordination and the rights of women in the church, and I would like to see that happen. Unfortunately, it takes a very long time for these things to happen in the Roman Catholic Church. But I do think that when you look at who is the American church, and I'll just come back home, you have the bishops, you have some conservative bishops. I do think they're going through a certain amount of soul searching in the election. I think there are a lot of middle-of-the-road bishops who do not like the way in which things got so politicized in this election. I don't think they believe the church should be as clearly aligned as the church was in some dioceses around the country. And you have all the people doing work in places like that homeless shelter, people who do the work for Catholic Charities, who do work in Catholic Relief. I mean, there is an enormous body of people who are working inside the church on behalf of justice in a deep sense. And I think at some level, at some point, this has to have an effect on the church itself. And, you know, we all have our Deus Ex Machina, and the great Roman Catholic Deus Ex Machina, and in general, the Christian Deus Ex Machina, is the Holy Spirit. Who knew that Pope John would become Pope John? Who knew that he would be elected in the first place? And what I want to close on, and the reason I'm glad you brought up Vatican II, I've been sort of thinking of sitting down with a bunch of Catholic friends and forming the Pope John the 23rd Society. And one of the reasons Pope John was so powerful was in his attitude toward modernity. What I worry very much in the church now is that we are moving away from his view of modernity. What did he say? He was very critical of those he called those mistrustful souls, who see only darkness walking the face of the earth. He was very critical of those who thought that modernity had nothing at all to teach the Catholic Church. And I think what he preached was the idea of a dialectical relationship between the church and modernity, where the church could be on important questions, and I think women's rights would be one of them, could learn, and democracy was another, where the church can learn from modernity. But I think there are forms of alienation in modernity and the kind of radical individualism that I think both of us are critical of, where I think the church has a lot to teach modernity. And so I suppose in the end, I am just betting on the same Holy Spirit who gave us Pope John the 23rd to bail us out of our problems again.